You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. First, though, our top stories here this evening. The police in Manchester are treating a triple stabbing in the centre of the city as a terrorist incident. A 25-year-old man is being detained under the Mental Health Act. Sky News has spoken to migrants across the Channel in France who say they fear for their lives. And a NASA probe has survived its flypast of the distant world known as Ultima Thule, the furthest object mankind has ever explored, 4 billion miles away. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. Our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the writer and researcher Maya Goodfellow and the author and journalist Benedict Spence. So hello to both of you. So let's take a look at the front pages then, and the Metro leads with the triple stabbing at Manchester's Victoria Station on New Year's Eve with the headline, "Nailed by Hero Cops." It's the same lead for The Sun, which calls it "Panic on the Platform." As we now know, the man arrested has been detained under the Mental Health Act. The Daily Mail reports on what it calls shocking figures on the amount of sugar being consumed by young people. Meanwhile, The Guardian leads with local councils feeling ripped off by landlords taking advantage of the growing homeless population. The Eye goes with the latest rail fare increases that have come into force. Its headline, "The £1 a mile rail journey." But the Daily Telegraph has some good news for rail users, that 16 and 17-year-olds are to get half-price rail cards. The Mirror speaks to a father who says he was driven to attempt suicide because of problems with his universal credit payments. The Times says that young women sent abroad for forced marriages are being charged by the Foreign Office for the cost of rescuing them. The Express reports that a total of 15 million people failed to turn up for their GP appointments last year. The Financial Times has a survey of 80 top economists, which shows that most of them think that Brexit will be bad or awful for the UK economy this year. While The Star has a story about a Coronation Street actor's apparent encounter with a UFO. So lots of different stories there to talk about with Maya and Benedict. And you've actually gone with the Times front page to kick off with, haven't you? And this is their own investigation, which they say shows that some victims of forced marriages, people who go abroad, they say for forced marriages, can be charged to be rescued by the Foreign Office. Yeah, so this is a story that where it seems that people are having to pay hundreds of pounds for things like their flights home, basic food, housing services, and if they do not have that money, this report says that people who are over the age of 18 and cannot afford to pay this are made to sign an emergency loan agreement with the Foreign Office before they board their flight home, and have their passports confiscated until they repay. And this actual report says that if they do not clear their debt within 6 months, officials add 10% to that bill. So, I mean, we don't know all the details around this. We know what the Times is saying. But if this is accurate, this is absolutely appalling that vulnerable young women who are wanting to come back to the UK, who are risking their safety, perhaps their lives trying to make it back to the UK, are then being told before they even get on the plane, you're going to have to, take out this loan. We are not going to support you as the state, which may scare some people. People don't want to take on this kind of loan. But it also means that the state is not providing this basic service of ensuring that people get back to the UK safely, and that then if they are not able to pay for their accommodation, for basic services, the state is then not supporting them. I think that this is absolutely appalling, and most people will be very happy for their taxes to go to supporting vulnerable young women. OK, let me just read out a statement that we've had from the Foreign Office, because we contacted them about this story, and this is what they've had to say. It's quite long. I'll try and précis it as much as I can, but bear with me. First of all, they say that the UK is a world leader in the fight to tackle the brutal practice of forced marriage. They go on to say that in very exceptional circumstances, including in cases of forced marriage overseas, we can provide an emergency loan to help someone return home. We recognise that an emergency loan can help remove a distressed or vulnerable person from risk when they have no other options. But as they're from public funds, we have an obligation to recover the money in due course. They go on to say, when people contact us for help to return to the UK, we work with them to access their own funds or help them contact friends, families or organisations that can cover the costs of returning to the UK. However, many of the victims of the forced marriage unit help who they help are vulnerable, and when offering any type of support, their safety is our primary concern. And they go on to talk about the fact that they do provide funding for safe houses and NGOs overseas and in the UK to help victims, and they don't charge British nationals for that service. So that's what the Foreign Office says about this.
What does that mean, world leader in ending the practice of forced marriage? Is there a league table for it? That just sounds like a meaningless platitude to me. If there is any truth to this, I think somebody deserves to lose their job over it. I think it's truly scandalous. It is an affront to all of our sensibilities and our moralities. It is just absolutely appalling to suggest that even if they aren't British citizens, that we would be charging them loans and, impounding their passports and their documents that give them any right to travel, and charging interest on those loans, not just giving them the loan in the first place, but actually ramping up the costs, all for the privilege of being rescued from a life of slavery and abuse. I'm almost speechless about it. It just seems absolutely disgraceful, and somebody, I think, has a lot of answering to do.
I think this isn't just about individual people being fired and making these decisions. What we have here is a really complex web of decision-making that has allowed this to happen if it is in fact true. And this idea that, these women are vulnerable, as was mentioned in that statement, they're vulnerable, so therefore we're going to increase that vulnerability by making them financially vulnerable, by not having the state support them, I think is incredibly worrying. And although this is a slightly different issue, it is the Foreign Office, and this is about potentially British citizens and forced marriage, this is actually part of a much broader, I think, problem with making people pay huge amounts of money in order to access government support, and in this kind of complex web we now have when people are trying to get support from the state. I think that this actually is really, really contradictory. The government saying that they want to support vulnerable young women, and at the same time making it so that those vulnerable young women may actually be less willing to try and seek that support.
As complex as it may be, nonetheless, at some point, somebody senior has signed off on this, that fundamentally that they think that it is acceptable for women that are essentially sold off, packed off into sexual slavery, into marriage, into a lifetime of abuse, that it is acceptable for them to be charged for the privilege of being repatriated or being rescued. Would we do this with people who have been kidnapped by ransomers or by terrorist organisations? I should think not. No, there'd be an outcry. So why is this acceptable?
OK, well,
ultimately, it is just appalling.
Well, the reaction is over the next few days. And Maya, you were saying you think that the public would be happy to pay this. And the government is pointing out there that it's public funds, so they have an obligation to recover them. So it'd be interesting to see what kind of debate this does trigger. In the meantime, let's move on to our next story, which is about rail fares. It's obviously the 1st of January today. The new rail fares will kick in. The hike is of 3.2%. 3.1%. The Eye covers this story broadly. The £1 a mile rail journey is what they call it.
Yes, every year we get this, that there's the issue over the increase in rail fares. And you can understand why, of course, the rail fares go up. Everybody says that we need to invest in our railway systems to improve them. Currently, especially in the north of England and in the east of England, the railway system is an absolute farce. But they are massively overpriced and people aren't seeing any real improvements in them. I mean, it can take you over an hour to get between Liverpool and Manchester. If you take the wrong train, it's only a 30-minute journey in the car. How is that acceptable? Ultimately, I think that the move to bring in half-price rail cards for 16 and 17-year-olds, as is reported in the Telegraph,
yeah.
Yes, exactly. I think that that is a good move because ultimately, who is it that funds fees for teenagers? It's their parents. And by and large, those will be parents who are also using the trains in order to commute, in order to get to work, in order to pay their bills. Therefore, they're being essentially charged twice for the privilege of not being able to afford to live in the middle of a town or wherever it is that they need to work. So I think that that is a very good move, but ultimately we need to have a long and careful look at where we're going with our railway systems. They are natural monopolies. They can't be run as many other things are in a free market system. It simply doesn't work. It's certainly not with the length of contract that is usually awarded to railway companies. I don't think that people will be especially happy to see this. They might be more inclined to be okay with price rises if they actually saw improvements in their services. But all too often we don't, and there are endless delays and cancellations that I think the public just are fed up of.
So what is the answer, do you think, Maya? I mean, do you think people would be prepared to pay higher taxes if they could subsidise train travel, or what do you think the answer is?
So, I mean, campaigners have actually talked about there being a fare freeze. There is a much broader issue around people's pay packet shrinking as the cost of living is increasing. And also there is this issue, it's very complex why there are fare increases, but there is a much broader issue around the privatisation of our railways. And at the same time as this is happening, the TUC has just released a report that shows that there's been £184 million paid out to shareholders of rail companies, and this is in the Times. So I think that people actually will be incredibly frustrated by the fact that they are paying for this service, a service that is not getting any better. And as you say, if you travel between some of the cities in the north, I'm from Newcastle, I know what the trains were like when they were privatised. I know how expensive it was, and I know how bad the service was. But I also know what it is like to travel between places like Doncaster and Sheffield. The trains are old, the line is poor, and people will be really frustrated by the fact that they are paying more, the service is not getting better, and at the same time they are seeing huge amounts of money go into the pockets of shareholders. And the reason for this is very complex, but all of this together doesn't look good for people.
And clearly, Chris Grayling is trying to get ahead of the game by writing in The Telegraph with this announcement about the rail card for 16 and 17-year-olds, no doubt anticipating that with the fare increase there might be a certain amount of flack headed his way. And he does make a pledge to say that he wants passenger journeys to be as good as they can be, wants to draw a line after what he describes as the chaos of 2018. But do you think this rail card announcement will appease people?
Well, anything rolled out by Chris Grayling, I'm very sceptical as to whether or not it'll be especially successful. But I must say, I'm not entirely sure that nationalising the railways would be the answer. I think, if anything, the railway companies themselves need a bit of a kicking. They need, shorter contract lengths when it comes to actually handing out these line contracts, so that actually, if they're not running the service effectively, they can't be allowed to just maintain, control of these things. But one thing that I would add, as every year we talk about the increase in rail fares and how services, especially in the north of England, are poor. At the same time, we are still ploughing ahead with the white elephant that is HS2, that is going to shave the journey time between London and the north by barely minutes. Actually, that is money that could be being put into services in the north of England.
Quick word on HS2.
Well, not on that, but very quickly on the rail cards. I think that's a sticky plaster for something that is a much broader problem. I'm not against those cards, but I think to suggest that is somehow a solution to what is a poor rail service for the whole country, people of all ages, is really misunderstanding the problem.
Okay. Rail cards for the under 30s, that's what we need.
I'm not included in that, so I'm not sure if I'll agree with that by quite a long way. Let's move on to these... He's good. Page 7 of the Mail we're going to move on to now. And this is last night's firework display in London, and it's caused a little bit of controversy. They're calling it political fireworks there.
Yes, I mean, in many ways, I actually quite admire this. It's a very brazen attempt to troll every Brexiteer in the City of London, and it's gone down quite well. You can just see the apoplexy online. People are very upset about it.
Well,
and
OK,
with
so
good
the
reason.
suggestion is that there was some kind of... Well, a pro-EU message was actually what...
A suggestion.
A pro-Europe message was what Sadiq Khan talked about, didn't he? He said it was a celebration of the capital's relationship with Europe and the message that London is open.
I don't think that was the message. He can dress that up all he wants, but actually I think that this is quite clear what this was meant to do, and that is to be actually very divisive and to bait a lot of people. We need to remember, actually, we need to remember that 40% of Londoners voted to leave the European Union. More people, in fact, than voted for Sadiq Khan to be mayor. This is a massive poke in their eye, essentially saying that, London is still a European city, and it has been echoed by Guy Verhofstadt today, who is everybody's favourite Eurocrat, who just can't keep his mouth shut, saying that even after Brexit, London will remain a European city. Yes, I'm sure that this was very perfectly
London
done.
did vote Remain overall, though, didn't it?
Overall.
We're still going to be part of Europe in the sense that part of the continent. I think that this is... I mean, people are angry about this. I am not someone who would walk around with an EU flag emblazoned on their top, because I would have no desire to, champion Fortress Europe that leaves people to drown at its borders. But I do think that if there is a message in here of Sadiq Khan saying, we want to welcome people from all over the world, people who actually had their status, EU citizens, their status plunged into uncertainty by the Brexit negotiations. I think it's quite good to actually send a message to those people that, yes, Britain, but London in particular, is still a diverse city and you are welcome here. I don't think it's that big of a deal.
It cost 2.3 million. I'd like to know when it is that Sadiq Khan is going to start whinging about not having enough money for police, having spent all that money on this. OK,
he may say that fireworks draw lots of tourists.
Yeah, I think
who spend money. Anyway, there's a whole other argument.
950,000 compared to the cost of 2.3 million.
OK. We haven't got time for that debate right now,
Fair
because we really
enough.
ought to get to a break, but another time, no doubt. Coming up after the break, though, the final frontier, well, for now anyway, the NASA probe that's boldly going where nobody has gone before. We'll be talking about that in a moment.